Alright, it's time to do the next step in the LS swap project, and that's going to be the wiring harness. So what I've got here is a 5.3 liter, and this is a test engine I use for different stuff, so it's on a test stand. You don't need this. This is just an easier way for me to film, but basically what you do is you get your engine, and you can just stick it on an engine stand, or it could be in the car. So the easiest way to do this is a stock wiring harness. It's got the stock fuse block connection and just all the stock connectors, but it's got a lot of extra wires that I don't need. So the absolute easiest way to do this, you can go online and there's pinouts, and those are great, and you can go through the list and you can just remove what you don't need. But what I like to do is take the harness, plug it onto the engine, and then just cut out everything that's not connected. I know that sounds simple, and it is. So we'll walk through that process. So right now, you're going to want your engine as complete as possible. I've got all my sensors in, map sensors, cam sensors, crank sensors, alternators on. The more you have, the better, just so you don't forget something or mess something up. I'm going to get started plugging this together. So here's an example of when you're going to have leftovers. So I got my alternator connected, got my throttle position sensor, my IAT motor. So this is the evap sensor, so I'm not going to be connecting that. So whenever you get something you're not going to connect, you just leave it hanging. I'm going to move over here, connect my fuel injectors. Coil packs. It can be a little difficult with the truck harness because it's laid out a certain way in the truck, so if you need to remove some of this to get everything connected, that's fine, but I find it a little easier just to try to connect it all and then remove the loom later. And then the trunk starts coming down to our temperature sensor. And even if I'm going to run it differently, I still lay it out just like it is on the truck to begin with. So I've got my temperature sensor over here, and then this is going to go down and around over to behind the starter. And some of these are the air conditioning plugs, so we don't really need those. Just these guys that are going into these. That one goes up behind there. I'm going to have to set the camera down for that one. So I'll keep connecting all the rest of these. And I've also got O2 sensors I can connect. So I'll keep connecting them, and I'll see you in a minute. Now all my connectors are connected. Coil packs, injectors, MAF sensor. See there's more plugs here. Not connected. I think this one goes to the windshield wiper pump or something. Got my long wires going to O2 sensors. These are all the fuse block connectors. These just stay here for now. Got all my transmission stuff just hanging over here. On the transmission one, the only one I'm removing is the rear O2 sensor. So it's obviously not connected. So now that I got everything up, we can start making a mess. So what you start doing, take off all these factory connectors, any kind of like anything that attached it to the vehicle. And then we're going to start pulling the loom off. A lot of it's going to be broken and cracked, and we're going to change it anyway, so I just trash all of it. Cut any of these guys off. Pull off any tape that's on here. Basically just strip everything off. Expose all our wires, and this is going to make a big mess, but since everything's connected, it's usually not too bad. So now you can see, took all the tape and the loom off, and the front O2 sensor basically just completely separates from the rear O2 sensor. When they assemble these, a lot of it's kind of assembled in units, I guess, and it just comes right apart. So then whatever I'm going to keep, like the front O2 sensor, I'll just tie up, kind of keep it out of the way. So I'm going to start on this side, and I'm just going to work my way over the whole engine, and I'll bring you back. Here's our path of destruction. I'm throwing all my junk over here. Got the harness nearly stripped down. This is why it's important to plug everything in first, because once you start cutting tape and pulling loom, it just turns into a big bowl of spaghetti. So I'm going to show you a little trick on these connectors, on how to take them apart so that you can put them back together and reuse them. So these come with this gray plastic clip on top. And it kind of took me a while to figure out how to get these off and be able to reuse them. So if there's any zip ties, you want to break those first. Alright, because those just attach it to the gray piece there. So now there's two sides to this. There's the what I'll call the solid side and the open side. So you want to start on the open side. You go on one end, you just kind of work a screwdriver in there. Then once it's worked in there, you're going to pry it like this, and that'll lift it up out just a little bit. Then go to the other end, try not to stab your wrist, do the same thing. Alright, so that one's loose. Then we're going to go to the middle, again do the same thing. Sometimes it'll slip back down in. Alright. So the open end is now done, so flip it around. You'll see it's kind of sticking out. And I usually push it that way while doing the same thing. So do one end, do the other end, and then this is the tricky one. You can, if you have something to slide down in here, you can, or once you undo the ends, you can kind of get a screwdriver under here and pop it out. So now you've removed it, and you didn't break any little tabs. So when you're done, you can snap this back in. And that's that. And then, like I said, pull the zip ties. So they got a couple choices. You can either cut your wires and tape them off, which is kind of janky and you might start a fire. Or you can de-pin them. So to remove these colored plastic clips, there's these white tabs in the side. So what I'm going to do, you got to get your hand in the right position. I'm going to grab it with these fingers and I'm going to push up. And while I'm pushing up, I'm going to undo one end. See, I've got it, I don't know if you can tell, I've got it tilted. This end is unclipped. Do the other end, keep some tension on it. Well, slid back down. So I got that end up and that end. And then they pop right off. This lets you push the pin out so you don't have any weird voltages going around. So now basically the whole harness is stripped down, crap's everywhere, but that's fine because this is what we want. So now I'm going to start, you start anywhere you want, any method you want, but we'll start up here with this guy. So I'm not using this anymore. So what I'm going to do is follow this through my bowl of spaghetti. And it's up to you if you want to cut the end off this and just pull each individual wire through, or if you want to try to feed them together. together can be a little bit tricky sometimes, depending on how it was ran. I'm going to try to do it in one piece to show you. Yep, found a piece of tape I missed. So get that out. Alright, so here's my evap plug. Just keep feeding it through here. So right here you can see it's kind of, when they assembled the harness, it went on either side of these group of pink wires are for the injector power. So it kind of just sticks there. So I'm going to cut this. Cut that wire there. Keep track of these two. So a lot of times you can kind of pull and see where it goes to. And this ball of wire is going to get cleaned up as we continue. Okay, so see, I've got some tension on the wire. That's this one right here. I'm going to pull it through just to double check. And this is where, if you want, you can have the printout of the wire pin out, and you can double check yourself before you remove any of these. So I fed it all the way through. That's the green wire. It's going to this connector right here, to this pin. So there's two ways you can get these pins out. One way is you can grab them with something lightly, or a screwdriver or whatever, and kind of lift it out to the side, then push it through, and then it'll come out the back side like this. Now if you need a wire for anything, now you've got a pretty long wire with a pin on the end. So I'm going to throw these into a separate pile. So now we'll go back to our pink wire, which should be switched power. We'll see where that leads to. Most of the sensors will just have one wire going to the computer and then one wire going to the fuse block. So that's probably where this pink wire is going, is to our fuse block. Alright, so I followed it back to there. Now you got a bunch of choices on what you can do at this point. Usually what I do is I'll just cut it, and then later on I'll come through and I can, depending on what fuse block you're going to use, you can either just throw it in the trash or de-pin it from the fuse block, which I'll show you later. So there's another wire, pink wire. So I'm going to toss that in my good wire pile, because you can use that for a lot of repairs or whatever you need to do. So that's one sensor done, and you see I didn't need any kind of a wiring diagram or anything at this point. So I'm going to continue through, and I'm going to keep pulling sensors. And again, you can do them in whatever order you want. So I kind of start from the outside in. So up here I've got my connectors I'm keeping all these. So let's find one that we don't need. So I had to take this apart to get the rear O2 sensor wires, which are these over here, out. So I've moved those out. So now this is going to stay like this. So just to make it easier on myself, I'm going to tape this up a little bit so I don't have this thing flopping around and get messed up. I left a little bit of tape right here. It's the original tape. And this is just the separation point between the vehicle speed sensor and the plug. That way I don't have to, like, let's say I tape them together like this. Now the speed sensor is not going to reach. So this will keep it in the stock location. So my wires are all covered with dirt and whatever, so I'm going to use some window cleaner. You can use whatever kind of cleaner, just as long as it doesn't really leave a residue so the tape still sticks. Spray it real quick. Wipe it real quick. This isn't something you need to spend a lot of time on, this just helps the tape stick better. Then the plugs I'll clean up later. I'm just worried about where the tape sticks for now. And this goes over to my neutral safety switch and those wires. And this is my front O2, which was damaged. So I'm going to put the rear O2 sensor plug there, but those are the wires. So now we're just going to wrap a little bit of tape. Start up here, and I like to keep it as tight as possible. The tighter your wiring, the smaller diameter loom you can use, and then it kind of looks better. So this isn't going to be like my final tape up or anything. I'm just going to throw a few pieces on to keep it semi-organized. Actually move that out so I can make sure it gets to my O2 sensor. So just kind of like that. Yeah, so there's the transmission wires kind of bundled up out of the way. I'll keep pulling out these rear O2 wires, same way I showed you with the other sensors. On some of the wiring, there's these kind of fused together junction splices, I guess we'll call them. So here's my rear O2 sensor wire. And it comes into this O2 sensor junction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it right there. As close as I can. So that I'm going to need to tape off. Can't remember what the brown wire does, but it does something. But I'm going to wait to tape it because one of these is the passenger side O2 sensor. So once I get that pulled up to here and cut off, see this one's the driver front. So once I cut the second one, I'll just extend this tape down a little bit, cover that up so we don't have any shorts in the harness. Here we are back at the connector. This is the purple wire from the rear O2 sensor from the one I just showed you, and I've got it pulled all the way through the harness, all the way up to this. So the second method for depinning these, instead of bending the pin over to get rid of this little white tab, you can just push the pin up from the back if you've cut it, and you can just pull it out the front. And a lot of times that's quicker, but either way doesn't matter. Just to do it this way, you have to cut the plugs off. So there's another long wire with the pin that I've got as a spare, so that goes in the spare pile. And I'll continue on. So where I'm at right now is I've got the sensors removed that I don't need off the engine itself. I've got my pile of trash and my pile of sensor wires. So the next step is to remove the additional communication wires that I won't be using. And this is where a lot of the pinouts come in handy if you do want to keep some features, but for the most part, for what I'm doing, I'm removing all these. So this connector here does have one wire that I'm going to use for the OBD2 sensor. And you can actually see up over here, so this yellow wire right here is the communication to the computer. And what I have is it's going up to the plug that plugs into the harness. So it's just this one wire that I need out of that harness. You can see it's the top one, Well, the end one on the connector side. I forget which number pin that is, but if you look up a wiring diagram, you'll see it. So I'm going to keep that wire out of that connector, and all the rest of them I'm going to pull out of the harness. And then everything on this plug is gone. I don't need any of these. And so I'll start pulling these wires apart. Okay, so I got those last wires pulled out of there that just go to mainly like the dashboard and the body control module and things like that. So my spaghetti bowl of wiring is a little bit smaller at this point, and I've still got everything kind of draped. So the next step, and one of the big advantages of doing it this way, is now you can route the wiring whichever way you want it on the engine. Stock the computers over here, but you don't need to do that anymore. So on mine, I'm going to be putting the computer over here on the passenger side through the firewall under the glove box. So I'm going to start routing all my wires over this way and bring them around. And without anything loomed up, you can kind of do whatever you want. Like my MAF sensor, I've got the wires here, and I have a kind of a cold air intake, so it'll end up being down here somewhere. So I don't want to tie it into like the fuel injectors. So I'm going to start laying it out the way I want it, and then start taping it back together. As you're retaping your harness, you're going to run into situations like this where you've got a lot of extra wire depending on where you're going. So what you do is you just loop it, run it along whatever trunk you're working on, then tape it. I left this one open to show you how it'll clean up once you put the tape on it. You want to give the tape some pressure to kind of compress this as much as possible. So you can see it was fairly bulky before, and now it's kind of tight. So there's a lot of sections like this, especially if you relocate the computer to a different area of the engine bay, that you're going to end up with those extra wires. So that's all you got to do with them, and then just continue like you're doing. Another thing I did while I was taping everything up is, because I'm putting the computer on the passenger side, one of the wires that was kind of too short was the coolant temperature sensor. So this is normally in the driver's side front of the head. So I kind of I didn't even have to cut it or move it or extend it or anything. I just kind of rerouted it while everything was untaped. And I'm going to put the sensor right there. So now it's going to be on the passenger side in the rear. And those are the things you can do if you do a harness this way, especially on the engine. And like up here, to give you an example, the fuel injectors, I've got everything all taped up nice and tight so that when I do loom it and put it on the engine, I can kind of tuck it under the fuel rail, and you'll barely see it once it's got black loom on it. So I'm almost done, and then I'll show you how to connect the fuse block. All the wires are removed that I'm going to remove. So this is the factory fuse block connector. You can see the ones that I've cut that I don't need. So when you connect this, these are going to be hot. So I don't want a bunch of loose wires hanging out. So I'm going to de-pin those. So to do them, it's pretty easy. There's these blue clips in here. You just get under there and pull them out. They slide out. That kind of releases all your pins. So that one right there, you just look at the position, flip it around, find out where it's at. Then there's a little clip in here. You just need something to go underneath it, and you can push the connector that way, and then it just comes right out. So I'm just going to remove the ones that are loose. Oops, that one goes back in. Alright, so all my loose wires are gone. There's a ground here, but it's got a ground that I'm using. So I'm just going to cut that one short. A ground doesn't worry me as much as a hot wire does. Once your pins are removed, you can go ahead and reinsert your retainer clips. So this connector is going to connect to the factory fuse block, which I've got here. This is just the stock factory fuse block. So then you need this connector, which this is also a factory connector, and I've just pulled out all the wires except for these two. So there's real small letters and numbers on here. So in the first row, number 9, which you can barely see, is this one. So when you give this wire 12 volt ignition power, it's going to energize your relays to power all your other circuits. And they only go in one way, but it goes in right there, I think. Alright, so now this is my 12 volt ignition source, which I connect right there, and I've got 12 volt ignition on the back side of this all connected. And then this is a constant 12 volt fused to the battery, and that goes on to your terminal. And pretty much all these terminals are connected internally, so it doesn't matter which one you connect to, but you can check them if you're not sure. So now the only wires I've connected are constant 12 volt and 12 volt switched. And then my grounds from the harness are all connected to the engine block, which is all connected back to the battery. And then I've plugged this together. This is the OBD2, which is the green wire, and that's just going through the connector to my OBD2 port for communication. So I'm going to double check my wiring real quick, then we will fire this thing up. I've got it pretty much all separated and kind of loomed up. Got my transmission lines over here, kind of just bundled up since I'm not testing those. Got my O2 sensors plugged in. Got all my other sensors plugged in. So let me double check all this, and then we should be ready to connect the computer and fire it up. Double checked all my sensors, everything's plugged in, everything looks good. I've got a flashed standalone computer. I'm going to connect that. Alright, so computer's connected, fuse box connected, got power to my scanner, battery's connected, everything should be good. Turn the key forward, listen for the fuel pump. Fuel pump's running good. No smoky wires. We'll see if she starts. Sounds like it ran good. Gonna have to turn the camera off and use my scanner to see if there was any codes that were saved, but it idle sounded good. Fired up just fine. So that harness, to make this, I used no wiring diagrams of any kind. I just connected what sensors I needed and ripped everything else out of the harness. I paid about 50 bucks for the harness and the fuse block. So that's about the cheapest standalone harness you can make. The only way to go cheaper is if you just left it completely stock with all the extra wiring. But so all that's left is for me to loom this up, kind of make it look a little bit pretty, and then it'll be ready to install in the car. So that is it. If you have any questions about any of the wiring, you can post in the comments, but I'll try to answer whatever I can if you got any.